do. And I'm so pleased that John Clapp and everyone here at the center have recreated that energy and brought folks together for the same kind of purpose that once existed. I should let you know I just came from a meeting in Wisconsin with compliance officers. And of course, you know what they want to talk about, Title IX, the flavor of this period. And once again, alcohol and drug prevention and recovery has been put a little to the side as we move into the Title IX world. And I reminded them gently that Title IX efforts depend very heavily on science-based prevention and recovery efforts. And more than one person came up to me and said, what is a science-based prevention and recovery program look like? And I said, wow, we still have a lot of work to do. My mission is far from over. Many of you in the room know me, some don't. If you don't know me, you know that I've been doing legal work primarily on college safety for 25 years, but I've connected that with prevention and prevention science in my work consistently. In fact, I even married into prevention. My wife Jennifer's in the front row, and she used to work at the Illinois Higher Education Center. We met when I was doing prevention work in the field, so I'm deeply connected to alcohol and drug prevention and recovery work, and again, it's just such a thrill for me to be here this morning. I don't know that this is a particularly fun topic, or even, it may be a little de-inspiring. I'll see what we can do with it, but I will tell you that the genesis of this idea for this topic, the idea of weaponization of alcohol and linking high-risk alcohol use prevention to Title IX, really came from this feeling that Title IX has dominated the landscape now of wellness. It's very easy to go to a campus and see the new Title IX office with a very well-funded directorial position and several assistants and educators, and then there we are with our prevention resources back like they were, in another period, sometimes still being cut and even marginalized. And yet, here I am at the Department of Justice one day working on the development of the new National Center for Campus Public Safety, and one of the top officials at DOJ takes me aside and they said, we completely understand the deep connection between AODV work and Title IX, that those two can't succeed without each other. And yet I don't know that our campuses always get that message. And so hopefully today I can give you some tools or ideas to take back to your campus to stimulate a discussion of how this work, prevention and recovery work, is so deeply connected with other efforts that are getting a lot of funding and a lot of energy right now. Efforts that will not succeed without seeing that deep link. So let's see if I can move this without destroying the computer. This is always the moment of choice when I hit the first key on the computer. And it worked. Yay, I didn't kill it. As you can tell, I'm from another era when we used the Bacchus and etc. Okay. I have placed up here what I call science government style. And one of the things I've gotten used to now, especially in the Title IX world, is that the federal government makes policy based on its perception of the science, and it doesn't necessarily matter whether this science is accurate or not. It nonetheless becomes the platform for federal policy development. Now, again, I tend to think that this data is largely representative of the data sets that are out there. It's roughly correct. And I know that there have been folks that have debated some of these statistics. But again, one thing I'm getting used to now, which is a little tricky for me to swallow sometimes, is that the government will latch on to a data set, and then it becomes a persistent theme throughout a regulatory experience. So this is truth, federal government style in some ways, if there is such a thing. And notice what we're seeing in the government's iteration of the science in the field, the staggering number of sexual assault victims. And particularly I'm drawing your attention to the fact that so-called incapacitated assault dominates the federal agenda, the recognition that so many victims and survivors are in what's known to the federal government as an incapacitated state. Now again, I know that you have been exploring and are much more conversant with the notion of the range of impact of alcohol and drugs on the capacity to give consent. I have very blunt-headed conversations with people who don't do your work, trying to explain to them the difference between being fully incapacitated and being in gray states where the choices that people make are not necessarily supported by their willpower or good decision making. This should be a mission, I think, to this group to try to articulate to people who do not understand the impact of alcohol and drug usage on choices and consent. I would make sure you keep pushing that, because I still run up against federal policymakers who don't seem to be able to make the difference between someone who's medically transportable and someone who is sufficiently intoxicated or under the influence of alcohol or drugs that they're in no position whatsoever to make decisions about their own body or intimate human contact. And in fact, one of the things that I'm learning in my Title IX work is that the predators out there are actually taking advantage of gray states. They are looking for victims who are not fully incapacitated. They're looking for ones that are in a gray state position. I'll explain that more as we go a little bit further along. But the sad reality of the Title IX work that I'm seeing is that the bad people are becoming much more sophisticated at how they pick their targets and how they cover their tracks after they make an attack. I mentioned this earlier, not all the data agree precisely on the level, and part of the reason is that reporting of sexual violence remains still tragically low. It was pathetic 5 or 6 years ago. Only just a small fraction of people came forward. We seem to have raised that. The newest data that I'm seeing is showing an increase in reporting, but it's still well below the 50th percentile mark, which means that we're still in many ways trying to guess exactly how many victims and survivors are out there. And if your campus is like mine, as we've opened the door to wellness and safety, more people are walking through it. I think you're seeing an uptick in the number of folks that are visiting you in your world. We're also seeing more reports in the Title IX world. I suppose I should have mentioned this, but I got tapped in February to be my university Title IX coordinator, which was really interesting. The person who'd been doing the job got another better job and left fairly suddenly, which is typical in this field. And my president called in a panic and said, I need some help. And so I jumped in, and I was in that job through the 1st of July. It was a fascinating tour of duty, to say the least, because instead of just being an expert about Title IX, I actually had to do it, which, if there are people in the room that do that, you know there's just a slight difference on that. The other point that I think is critical is that subpopulation statistics on alcohol and violence, around sexual violence in particular, vary quite a bit. And the policymakers have drawn some attention to that. But again, I'm not sure that that's widely understood on college campuses among key decision makers. One statistic that we probably should have thrown up, but I was trying to keep the slides as compact as we could, is LGBTQ rates, which are just startling when you see them. You're looking at 50 percentile rates. I mean, it is unbelievable when you read the statistics. And the other thing that's extremely disturbing, particularly in that subpopulation, is the connection between alcohol, drug, violence, sexual violence, and suicidality. Something that has become increasingly disturbing to me. So I know one of the young men, Travis, Tyler, okay, I know it was something, sorry, I'm terrible with proper nouns. You were making the connection with social justice, et cetera. And I think I'm going to make a pitch for interdisciplinary work, which I think was implicit in what you were saying, that it becomes so critical for us to connect our prevention and recovery work to Title IX, to other violence prevention work, and to the special folks on campus who deal with suicide and mental health issues. That these are not separate issues, but overlap very, very deeply with each other. And what I'm hoping today is that I give you a little ammunition to push the alcohol and drug and violence prevention and recovery efforts into the center of the dialogue as opposed to the margin. Again, the backing that I know you have is all the way to the top, at least at Department of Justice. I know they recognize the deep connection here. So stay at this work. I've seen improvement in emphasis on AODV over the last 25 years. I know Kim Dude is in the room. It hasn't gone as far and as fast as I hoped it would, but things are better today than they used to be. I also think one of the things that we need to focus on is relationships between sexual violence and other violence in our highest risk drinkers, however we define them. I still resist the term binge drinking. I don't know where you stand on that, but what I noticed in my work is that the folks who were in the predatory pile tend to be very close to the edge of or in the highest risk drinking categories. That they are associated with, they're either on the edge of that culture or they are participating in it some way. And so that tells me something as well about the relationship of alcohol to sexual violence on campus and how alcohol is becoming, in some ways, more of a weapon in that population. The other thing I'm intrigued by is interaction between alcohol and other drugs. Now, of course, in the Title IX world, it's not uncommon to see predators mix alcohol with some other substance in an attempt to subdue the victim. That's very common, and we're familiar with the so-called date rape drugs. But I think there are more complex relationships here with marijuana, with Adderall and Ritalin. And I think as we do our survey work and we crunch the data, I think we're likely to see correlations and connections here that alcohol may be the dominant weapon of choice for predators, and it certainly is. But they don't just bring a gun to the attack, they bring a knife and a grenade. And they're well prepared to using multiple weapon sources to overcome their victims and create the attacks that they do. By the way, I also want to make sure you realize I do acknowledge the fact that a large amount of sexual issues that we have on campus are non-predatory, and that's something we'll be talking about here as we move through the slides. Here again is some science on this, and this is from our friends at NIAAA, talking about the prevalence and connection between alcohol and sexual assault. We've known this for years. This is not brand new information to us. To the government, this is startling insight. They are just now discovering this. And you have to have a little patience with the fact that we've been there all along. It's just you finally found us. It's sort of that feeling that Christopher Columbus must have had when he discovered the New World. And the people that were there were like, we've already been here for a while. This world is only new to you, not to us. This is our home. Okay. Notice again, more NIAAA statistics. We see alcohol again being incredibly prevalent in acquaintance rape situations. The statistics just consistently bear that out, which leads me to one inexorable conclusion, is that the predators are using alcohol as the weapon of choice. That this is the attack point, among others, one of the ways that they're coming in to victimize. We also are trying to get better ideas again about subpopulations, and it does appear that the prevalence of some of the weaponization is particularly notable in Caucasian populations that we've seen that. Again, that just is something that's drawing out of the data. What this might mean for multiculturalism efforts, we'll have to see. But it suggests to me that alcohol's weaponization may play differently in multicultural contexts. Again, as the science develops, we'll get a better sense of what's going on. How do predators use alcohol? Well, many of you already know this, but I thought I'd take you on a tour of my experiences and what I've seen from the front lines on this. Camouflage is one of the classic techniques of the modern sexual predator. It's a key tactic in luring and subduing a victim. The camouflage takes a number of different forms, and it often is social camouflage. So we'll see students who will blend into Facebook or student leadership positions, often be very high socially functioning, well thought of on campus. It's a kind of camouflage, making the alligator not look like an alligator, just like a log in the river, and everyone is lured into a false sense of security with that individual. But in addition to that kind of camouflage, what we know from studies related to predators, and they tell us this, is that they typically are going to try to find a way to camouflage the alcohol or drugs that they're going to ply their victims with. So sweet drinks, heavily sweetened source drinks are common, tasteless drugs in some kind of combination. Very common technique is to attempt to camouflage so that the victim will not realize the quantity of alcohol or intensity of alcohol that they're using. They'll also typically try to lure the victim away from protective factors, such as food or friends, so that camouflage is even more effective, so that you just sort of walk into the river thinking, this is a lovely place to take a dip today, and instead the opportunity predator strikes. We also see some fairly disturbing pre-selection of victims. And very often, our predators will admit that they have pre-selected and targeted an individual before they attack. Typically someone who is younger. The statistics bear out that a lot of violence is directed towards freshmen and sophomores. And so they're looking for inexperienced drinkers. Again, another way alcohol is being weaponized, and trying to take advantage of that inexperience with alcohol as a way to complete an attack. It's particularly disturbing when you realize that these predators now do not always operate in isolation. We're seeing more evidence of team behavior, like velociraptors in Jurassic Park. And the other thing that will be very disturbing to many people is to realize that it is not just men that are involved in that. Sometimes women are actually participating in the staging and coordination process of the attacks, which I think throws a lot of the investigators off, because you wouldn't assume that that would be taking place. But again, this is part of the weaponization and camouflage process that this subpopulation of sociopathic predators is using. We think that it may be typical for a predator to strike at least 12 times before they're first detected. And I'm not talking about convicted or disciplined. I'm just saying detected in the environment. One of the more common themes in the kind of recovery work that we do is we will hear a young lady typically come in and say, I've had this incident with this young man. I don't really want to push this forward through a grievance process. But then that person discovers that her friends have been victimized by the same individual, and you start to see the pattern. And even the victims themselves are not typically aware of the fact that they've been preyed on by someone who is systematically working through the system. Again, alcohol plays a profound role in this. What we're seeing is, and again, this is the theme that I really wanted to hit on today, is that our predators are actually using alcohol as a weapon. So we're moving beyond non-functional use. We're now in weaponization of alcohol. And this really hit me when I realized that my vision of a sexual predator from another era was an individual lurking in the bushes with a ski mask and a club or a knife to subdue a victim. And that does unfortunately still take place. But the modern predator has replaced the ski mask with a navy blue blazer, and has replaced the knife or the club with alcohol and Rohypnol, Adderall, Ritalin, etc. And getting that concept through to people, I think, is a very critical thing in the prevention and recovery work we're doing, because again, we will be seeing these folks come through our alcohol and drug systems, sometimes independently of a sexual assault scenario. The staging of attacks is something that's really quite remarkable. And when I look at a predatory attack, it usually has a certain set of signatures to it. We'll be developing this as we go further into the presentation today. And again, I know this is such a dark topic to follow such a warm morning introduction, but I suppose that when you come to Hogwarts, you've got to do a little defense against the dark arts. And today I'm playing the role of Snape, I suppose. It's who actually is kind of my sort of a hero in that book. But anyway, I see we have some Harry Potter fans out there. That's good to know that we haven't completely lost our minds. You would be surprised, if you're not familiar with this work, as to the efforts that the predators will go through to set an attack up. And among the things that they will like to do is not only pre-select a victim, but they're also going to pre-select a site of attack. And they will typically stage that so that they can move their victim from a common area of a party, for example, to an isolated space, and a space where there's virtually no chance for the victim or survivor to fight back or retreat. Also a space that will be sanitized so that evidence will be very difficult to collect from a scene. Often there's very little to identify the room. You'll hear victims and survivors only be able to pick out certain details from a space they've been in. The room has been designed that way. What I'll see is a common party room, an open source, lots of sweetened drinks, and then an upstairs bedroom that's just a bed, blacked out window, no furniture, nothing to identify it, almost like an interrogation space. Is the way I would describe some of these spaces, is how they're created. And what you realize is this is no accident. This isn't something that evolves through a period of bad decision making. This is actually a very highly thought out criminal act that's designed to camouflage the intentions of the attacker, weaponize alcohol, reduce the victim's ability to resist, and then wipe the slate clean after the attack has occurred. And again, the freshmen and sophomores who are less experienced with this behavior are typically the targets that people point out. I would really urge you to take a look at David Lisak's Undetected Rapist video if you have not seen it. And again, it is not that this work has been uncontroversial, because it is. There are folks that have contested Lisak's findings, but what I think you do need to realize is the federal government has based a substantial amount of policy effort on the veracity of this data. So again, in many ways, this is truth, government style, and whether it's good science or not, and I know there is some foundation in science for it, that's for you to decide, the people in the room that do that kind of work. But again, the government certainly has latched onto this kind of thinking, and honestly, I've seen it in practice. This is not just theoretical work to me. I know what this looks like in a real world situation. How do we identify weaponization, and how can AODV people and recovery folks help in that process? Well, I think the main thing that I want to pull out of here is that we really have to do cross-training with our Title IX staffs on links between alcohol and sexual assault. And I hinted to this earlier, but one of the major areas that our Title IX staff, adjudicators, investigators need help on is understanding the psychophysical dynamics of alcohol and drug use and the states that people are in that period, how it affects recollection and decision making, etc., vulnerability. All of this needs to be part of the dialogue. I have found in my Title IX training that people want to focus more on criminal justice like investigative techniques, very specific sexual assault advocacy techniques, and none of that I think is inappropriate, but the link between alcohol and drug is sometimes not emphasized the way it should be. And again, I do think our Title IX systems need to be cross-talking with each other to be much more effective. Again, I mentioned if I see a situation where there's some kind of coordination to the attack, some kind of logic to the sequence of how things have evolved, I start to suspect that I'm not dealing with two young people who've made choices that are difficult to reconcile. I'm dealing with a predatory attack. And I think this is one of the most difficult things in Title IX work, is trying to sort out the people who have gotten themselves into a tough situation where bad decisions have been made, as opposed to a situation where there's been someone who is staging a violent attack with the purpose of harming another human being, and very little empathy to go along with that, which, by the way, is another sign. We'll come to that in a second. Now, I think this might be one of the crucial points of the presentation for a lot of folks, because this is not well understood in the Title IX field and not widely discussed in the literature. The government, I think, has lured us to believe that our typical predators now are looking for incapacitated victims, which to many people is medical transport, passed out drunk level. And the reality is the predators have actually evolved away from that. I think they did at one time look for targets like that. I've seen instances of it where the goal was to incapacitate, fully incapacitate, essentially paralyze the victim with alcohol or drugs. One horrible legal case that I've worked around, I talk about frequently actually on my legal circuit, is one where a resident assistant facilitated the severe intoxication of a visiting student from another campus who was underage, placed her in a room with a friend, and then the friend staged multiple rapes, including inviting his friends to participate in the process. It's a really disturbing situation and has all the hallmarks of a predatory staged attack. This is the sort of thing that we're seeing, is these kind of coordinated, highly thought out attacks. And when I start to see that in the activity sheet or the sheet on information we're getting, I realize this is what we're really looking at. Now, so what are we seeing today? What's the shift away from incapacitated victims? What we're seeing today is gray state attacks. And there's a very simple reason for this. The predators know that if someone is passed out drunk, they are likely to trigger a medical intervention, and a medical intervention will now potentially involve a rape kit or other law enforcement involvement. And what we're seeing in communities now, because of SART and other work that's being done nationally, is that first responders are becoming much more conversant with the fact that someone may have been the victim of a predatory sexual assault. The predators have learned this. So what they're doing is they're bringing their victims to gray states short of incapacitation or paralyzed state on purpose. In fact, what they want now is they want the victim to walk away from the crime scene. One of the more common occurrences now, in what you'll see in the fact patterns I've dealt with, is there will be a staged attack, often a common sweet source of alcohol. The victim, typically a female, will report being in a very bleary and state where judgment was difficult, being lured to a space that was sanitized, and then typically overpowered at that space. One of the techniques that's common is arm bar to the throat, restrict airflow. It doesn't leave a mark, and when you are fairly advanced in your intoxication state and someone is restricting your breathing, it typically triggers a trauma response in the brainstem that essentially paralyzes the victim even though they're conscious. So our victims will typically be unable to flee or fight during the period of the attack because of a natural process of how individuals behave in a trauma state. When the attack is completed, the perpetrator will typically leave. The victim will regain some ability to move and then return to a safe space, usually to their dormitory room, residence hall, family, or whatever. And what is one of the more common things that a victim will do is they'll freeze. They won't do anything for 24 or 48 hours, which plays exactly into the hands of the perpetrators, because they know that effective law enforcement prosecution of a predatory attack usually depends on good forensic work being done in the first 48 to 72 hours. What am I suggesting to you? We have highly sophisticated adversaries, vampires on campus really, who know exactly how to play alcohol and drugs, and they have staged it in a very sophisticated way, even though it does not appear to be that way. What looks like a sloppy party is actually a highly staged crime scene where alcohol has been weaponized in an extremely sophisticated way. Again, this is a very dark message to bring. I'm teaching you the Cruciatus curse, which is something that's one of the forbidden curses at Hogwarts, but I think that you should know about it. One of the other features of this is it is very common for the perpetrators to self-medicate to complete crimes. An overlooked fact, but do you remember the lacrosse murderer at Virginia? Hughley and Yardley Love. Okay, I have a perspective on that. You know, this comes from both prevention work and being a lawyer. This is a guy that was, again, in an acquaintance situation. More typical pattern now, because our predators are getting to know their victims before they attack. And this individual is charged with first-degree murder and could have received, I think, the death penalty in Virginia. That we were talking about that. His defense was, I was a stupid drunk. This was his defense in court. I drank too much and I did something stupid. And the jury bought it, and they gave him second degree. So he'll serve a very long sentence, and he avoided capital punishment. My experience with that type of individual is quite different, because what we're often seeing, much like suicidality, is that some of these folks, if they have a shred of any empathy or hesitance, will self-medicate to complete the crime. Whatever socialized impulses they have, they'll deliberately use alcohol as a way to reduce those socialized impulses to complete the attack. And so I don't see a guy like Hughley as a stupid drunk. I see him using alcohol as a weapon against his victim, because he's literally using it as a way to trigger or to reduce his socialized impulses. And again, that's a very hard message to communicate to people who don't have sophisticated understanding of alcohol and drug and violence work, but this is the new reality with some of the very dangerous people that are on campus. What's the goal of most of the predators is to reduce detection. They want camouflage. They want to not be identified before they attack. They want to not be identified after they attack. And they also know how to avoid prosecution. They're very much aware of what we call here the 48-hour rule, sometimes also known as the 72-hour rule. But somewhere between 2 and 3 days after an attack, forensic evidence collection diminishes to the point that very few prosecutors will ever take a case. So that just out of sheer reality in this, if you are a criminal and have a criminal mind in this world, you will know that if you can cover your tracks in that area after the 48 to 72 hours, you are likely to get away with the crime. And then what else will you do during this period? You will try to convince the victim that it's their fault or that they made a mistake. So what's very common is you'll see text messages or yicky-yacky type tweety things, and they will come between the perpetrator and the victim. And what the perpetrator will try to do is lure the victim into making statements against self-interest. Didn't you wanted this, didn't you? And you disappointed me, and I'm sorry that we don't have a relationship. Why did you walk out on me? You see the kind of camouflage that they'll lay down afterwards. They may even begin to work the friends or family of the victim to get them to believe a narrative of a mistaken sexual encounter when in fact it was a predatory attack. This is how sophisticated this is, and believe me, this is all planned out. This is not just spontaneous behavior, but it's one of the signals of what we've got. How do I know when I've got one of these people in a Title IX hearing? One of the things that I notice almost immediately is lack of empathy. I look for language and tone, and how people describe an incident or a sexual encounter. I would, again, encourage you to watch the LESAC video, which is a recreation of interviews with actual predators who are in jail. And one of the things that's really, really sickening is remorselessness. There's no remorse. The testimony that some of these people give is reminiscent of the way Eichmann testified at Nuremberg. Just complete lack of empathy and remorselessness. Chilling, really, when you're around it to realize that. They will often pick terms and use a certain tone that's just not what I would consider to be normal. And again, that's the other thing we're dealing with here is a segment of deviant personalities really are not the same as the folks that we're dealing with in some of these cases. Their recovery efforts, if we'll see them, I think will be far more challenging. The other thing we'll notice is that they'll engage in a lot of victim blaming work. So we'll hear a lot of language that's directed to blame the victim. She led me on. It wasn't fair the way she treated me. As opposed to showing empathy for someone who's been in a severe state, they'll tend to try to flip the energy back and do some victim blaming. These are signatures to me that I may have someone who is more than just someone who's made a mistake in a hearing. And again, these other little things are there. By the way, is this helpful to you all, or you're all just like, boy, I'm glad this conference is coming to an end. Who's coming up next? It's, this pretty dark stuff. Clues in social media, again, I think we did cover that. Again, keep in mind that the weaponization process is not just alcohol, it's also social media. So coming at the victim after the attack and trying to create a narrative is a big part of these kinds of behaviors. It's very important to have good amnesty policies and good Samaritan policies, because one of the things that our predators will do is try to convince the victim that if you come forward, you were drunk too. and you're going to get in a lot of trouble. You were using a drug illegally, and that is going to get you in a lot of trouble. I will tell you that one of the more popular combinations are the opiates with alcohol and the opiate derivatives. Keep in mind this is a population with a lot of wisdom tooth surgery, and it just times out that way for most people. And my dentist, when I had my wisdom tooth out, gave me a 40-count bottle of some massive opiate derivative, and I took a half a pill because I don't really like drugs. I'm sort of that way, and so I called her up and just to tease her, I said, "What do I do with the other 39 and a half? What are they selling for at the high schools these days?" And she was mortified, and I said, "You're over-prescribing this stuff. I don't need 40 pain pills I needed a half of one." And what ends up happening is these flow through our college campuses, as you know, and it is very popular to combine those with alcohol. The predators sometimes use a little dash of this or that, many of the pain-killing drugs, as a way to put things together. Now, of course, that's incredibly illegal, and people know that, so one way to scare a victim from coming forward or survivor is to tell them that you're going to get in a lot of trouble. Therefore, the Department of Education and schools around the country are pushing amnesty policies, and I have found those to be essential tools to be able to get the bad people off our campuses. How do we integrate all of this? One thing that's really great for AODV work right now is that the Clery Act, as it's been amended recently, now specifically requires that we have sexual assault and awareness programs that are evidence-based and public health oriented. Shall I say environmental management, NIAAA Institute of Medicine. They're essentially mandating that we do this. But I'll tell you what's really interesting is that most Title IX staffs, unless they have the luxury or the good fortune of being deeply connected to a strong prevention effort, really have no idea what an evidence-based, comprehensive public policy and public health-oriented approach looks like. They don't understand that modeling, and no joke, when I was in Wisconsin, repeatedly people came up to me and said, "What does an evidence-based prevention program look like? I don't even understand the concept of that." And that tells me that we have so much to offer the Title IX world as it has to offer us. And teaching people about what public health modeling looks like, what a comprehensive environmental program could be, how to assess it, and of course deeply what the connection with alcohol is becomes critical going forward. This is just out of the government material. This is their way of modeling for people that don't know much about this, what a comprehensive campus strategy might look like. And this is essentially NIAAA Institute of Medicine Light. This is the watered down version of a light beer. And when I first saw this, my first instinct with this is the government realizes that the folks that are doing this work have so little connection to the public health world that we're going to have to tow them into some really basic metrics just to get them some idea of what that would look like. But if you see this, you can see immediately how much more we could be doing to help people move down the public health dimension on Title IX work. Prevention. Now again, I know you've spent a lot of time at this conference talking about recovery, which is fantastic. I'm still a prevention guy. Not that I'm opposed to recovery, because I'm not, but it's just my focus in my career has been a lot on prevention work. And I think one of the signature challenges right now for AODV prevention work is to be careful about victim blaming. And it has exploded on the internet several times. I had Emily Yaffe at my conference at Stetson this February. You might know her. She's Dear Prudence of Slate, although she doesn't like to be overly identified with that. She hasn't become Adam West and Batman, where the two identities are sort of creepily merged with each other. And Emily wrote a piece and basically said, and she's a take no prisoners kind of writer, she said, young women, if you want to reduce the risk of being attacked, drink less. And she had probably one of the greatest flame wars ever directed at her, including her co-editors, just launched on her. in very vitriolic ways, and she was pretty startled by that response. And we spent a great deal of time talking about it. I don't know quite where she's landed with it, but I tried to remind her that the sexual assault victimization and advocacy world has been a world that once upon a time was a lot like prevention. It was something down the hall. People didn't really want to attend to it. It wasn't getting prime public policy focus. And people in that world are legitimately very sensitized to anything that sounds like victim blaming, because that has been the kind of argument that's been used again and again to turn people away from the help that they need. It was ironic, we were in Las Vegas doing a Title IX training, and Jennifer got robbed at a casino. That someone took her wallet. So she went down to the highly empathetic Las Vegas Police Department, which apparently has given up on the idea of stopping people using marijuana in public spaces on Las Vegas Boulevard. If anybody wants a contact high, you should go immediately to Las Vegas, because it's just everywhere you walk, it's marijuana smoke. And she walked into the officer, and I mean, I'll recreate this precisely, I'm sure, but the first thing the officer said is, "What were you doing carrying all that money in your wallet and all your things? What are you victim blaming right out of the gate?" And I'm like, my wife has been robbed, and your first instinct is to make her feel worse over this? What are you, my Irish mother? It's just, and of course, to making light of this, but this has been also the pathway of sexual violence, is I go to a prosecutor and like, what were you wearing? Did you know the guy? How come you didn't fight back? It was even in Justice Harding's decision in the Jameis Winston matter. I don't know if you read his report. I did. FSU hired the best jurist in Florida, the former Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. And Justice Harding has an impeccable reputation in Florida. I don't think he was victim trained or trauma trained. And part of his decision was, well, the victim didn't report quickly, and there were inconsistencies in the story. Well, guess what? With trauma training, what we learn is that victims frequently have gaps in the story and latch onto unusual facts that would seem strange to us but make perfect sense when you understand the science. People often do not report. They freeze or flee from the scene. It may take years for people to come forward. What are we seeing with that? Well, from a victim and survivor point of view, it feels like victim blaming, and they're very, very sensitive to that. So one of the challenges is to do our work and make sure that people understand the statistical connection between alcohol and violence, but in no way, shape, or form turn that against the victims, and make the right connections, in other words, between primary prevention and Title IX work. And I think it's challenging. I notice a lot of AODV folks have almost feel concerned about moving forward into the Title IX world for fear that they'll suddenly become the bad people, the victim blamers, when there's no intention to do that. How do you do it? Well, I think one thing is to focus a lot on social norming. The Title IX world has picked up social norms. So way to go, Wes. You'll get, if you know who you'll get the reference. That's a little, yeah. I've been around this field an awfully long time, so maybe too long. I remember when social norming first hit the field and became a big thing. And what's interesting is it has transposed into the Title IX world. The government now has clearly said you should engage in social norming on campus. So this is one thing that we can teach our Title IX systems how to do and connect it with other prevention work that helps. Also working with men. We can help men who, by the way, are victims too. And one of the really scary things that's out there is that male reporting of victimization is exceptionally low. And I don't get a feeling that it's improving anywhere near as fast as it needs to. The social stigmas regarding male victimization are so strong. I've had 2 incidents in my life. One, I refer to myself as a survivor, another a victim. And every time I talk about it, people just walk away. They don't really want to pursue what happened, what did you go through. And boy, if you want to get that experience that President Obama talks about being alone, I understand that feeling full well, because it's almost like telling someone you've had a cancer diagnosis. They want to change the subject to the weather. They move quickly away from it. we have a lot of work to do in helping men help other men socialize, prevent rape, but also not become victims. And I suppose I should just drop this in here, is I do think that our field of recovery and prevention is going to have to contend with the reality that we do have a generation of young men who are very challenged. I really do worry about young men transitioning into the post-industrial world, and the jails are filled with stories of this. Our discipline records are. Something is going wrong in transitioning young men into civilized society. I'll just stop with that, but I think there is definitely a connection here. Something else that's evolved, which I think is very important in the science, and I certainly want to draw your attention to it, is the community efficacy work, which has translated into bystander intervention training on campuses. But I want to go to the root of this. I had a chance to see Dr. Felton Earls. If you get a chance, he's wonderful, who is on the Chicago Project, a longitudinal criminal study in Chicago trying to understand the roots of crime. And this is one smart guy. I remember spending about an hour with him in Virginia listening to him talk, and I honestly didn't have any idea what he was saying for the first hour. It was just way over my head. And again, I always appreciate your patience with me, because we have really amazing research scientists in the room, and you're just so much farther along on science than I ever got. But I honor the presence of that, and Dr. Earls is one of them. And when he wrapped his work up, he came up with a startling conclusion that's become the foundation of so much other work. And the conclusion was actually quite simple, almost obvious once you saw it, that the communities that are safer are not necessarily the ones with more money or more police patrols or police intervention. They're actually communities that have high levels of efficacy. And I thought we started the morning when I walked in with this concept of caring for each other, wellness. This is the root of safety, prevention, and recovery, is creating communities of care and compassion. And interestingly enough, the science is now telling us that if we build and support our communities of care, we get lower rates of sexual assault, lower violence, better outcomes overall. This has translated in Title IX world into bystander intervention training, which has become the new fad, and I think a very good one that's been running through our field. I will do just a little bit of literature review for you here. This is, in case you're not familiar with bystander intervention, which I would imagine you are, here's sort of the very light version, the preliminary lit review. I use this slide, actually, I think what this is probably most helpful for you is when you return to your campus and you're trying to explain bystander training to Luddites like me, give them this slide. Steal it, use it, take it, and this is a good basic way to tow people into this kind of work. I'm just going to back up if you don't mind. What else should we be doing in addition to bystander training? Well, I think that we want to be very careful about pushing primary prevention efforts without linking them to very good grievance response systems. This is a lesson I've learned the hard way working in Title IX systems, that if you emphasize primary prevention without giving people a very visible way to bring their grievances and seeing that we're responding to them, they tend to really push back on prevention efforts. Or to put this another way, the future of AODV prevention on college campuses, I think, depends very heavily now on whether our grievance systems are accepted by our populations, that we have an investiture in making sure that our Title IX grievance systems function well, which then loops us back to what we did in the beginning. Because I'm hoping that it occurs to folks now that if your Title IX system isn't coming to you, you need to go to it. You need to help it understand what is consent, how is consent affected by alcohol and drug use, how do certain subclasses of offenders weaponize alcohol and camouflage. You can help them understand this and build systems that are more effective. Because here's what is happening in a lot of the systems: without that good grievance connection, the predators slip away, and the discipline systems are flooded with people who are in he said, she said scenarios that typically result in outcomes that satisfy neither person that have been in the proceeding. And it diminishes the efficacy of the system. And then young people walk around campus thinking, what kind of a system are we running? Where my friends who have too much to drink get in a whole lot of trouble, but the person that everybody knows is preying on everyone else slips away in the night and doesn't get prosecuted by anybody. That diminishes the efficacy not only of Title IX, but also of prevention work. And I hope that that becomes clear to people here. We live and die together now in a very important way. I have seen campuses push primary prevention ideas and do that ahead of their grievance process. It's even cost a couple college presidents their jobs because they've stepped in the middle of this trying to push a primary prevention message, but the community is not willing to accept that message until they feel that there are good Title IX response systems in place ahead of time. I can't say this enough. We have to be extremely careful with our language, linguistics, and even semiotics, the symbols that we're using, not to engage in victim blaming. Now, I know there isn't anyone in this room who's a victim blamer. I can't imagine there's anybody here that even comes close to that. In fact, quite the opposite. I think we're the people who go out of our way not to victim blame. We realize that people in recovery need a chance to recover, and that the blaming process is nothing but a hindrance in that particular process. So I'm among the cognoscenti with this. But here's the interesting thing is that as careful as we can be, there are times that we sometimes unintentionally stumble into approaches or language systems that will cause a response or trigger a response in victims or survivors. So being hypersensitive to anything that suggests tacit or implicit victim blaming is going to be critical. One practical way to do this is to be working with focus groups, if you can, either with your Title IX system or external to it, and get feedback from your focus groups on how they would respond to the articulation of programs, ideas, policies, etc. before they're deployed. Talk to the people and use these kind of focus group type works. I think is very helpful to get a sense of what's going to explode and what is not. Generally speaking, if you do accidentally use a trigger term or walk into some kind of tacit victim blaming, a focus group will detect it almost instantaneously. It's not something that usually lurks under the bed at night. It is quite visible if you put it out to those populations. We saw this literature review. Sorry I jumped ahead on the slide. Big message, and I think it's true for us, but I think we need to teach our Title IX systems this as well, that good alcohol and drug prevention work and recovery work is no longer a hobby.